have slept since the world was young. Since before your empires, kingdoms, or tribes. Since before you first deemed it necessary to record your histories. I remember the oceans were blue. I remember the forests were green and filled with song. I remember the sun-baked mountains and the fresh air that moved between them. Yet now my world is painted in inky blacks and reds. As I look through my window out into the darkness of the world, I have not even my reflection in the glass to keep me company. All I have left is hunger.
Hello, my name is Ben Byrne, and this is how you make vampires formidable in your Dungeons & Dragons campaign. Vampires are incredibly well-worn territory when it comes to literature and pop culture. We have countless books and novels, we have graphic novels, we have TV shows, we have movies, we have video games, and we even have other role-playing games that are entirely centered on either fighting vampires or being a vampire. And therefore, a lot of the mystery has been torn away from this ancient monster when it comes to featuring them in your 5th edition D&D campaign. As soon as the party find a corpse with 2 puncture wounds on the neck that has been drained of blood, they're instantly going to start stocking up on their garlic, their crucifixes, their holy water, their silver, and their wooden stakes, because you need to give very little clues before the party works out they're about to fight a vampire. And these monsters, because of their lack of mystery, have resulted in a lot of people either making fun of vampires or just not taking them very seriously anymore. And this means that it's hard to feature a vampire in a genuine horror or dark fantasy D&D campaign in a way where this monster demands the respect that it is owed. Well, as anybody who knows me knows, I absolutely love vampires. They are my favorite monster, not just in role-playing games like D&D 5th edition, but I think they're one of the greatest monsters ever conceived in all of human mythology. And therefore, I want to tell you how to run a vampire in your D&D 5th edition campaign that is both formidable, frightening, and can be at the center of your entire campaign. We're going to address 5 key things that you should keep in mind when you're going to have a vampire appear in your D&D campaign. And they are, number 1, defining what is a vampire, especially in your game of Dungeons & Dragons. Number 2, subverting the player expectations of what a vampire is. Are crucifixes even relevant in a world where there are different gods? Number 3, we're going to rework the vampire stat block. While I actually don't dislike the vampire stat block from 5th edition, if we're going to redefine what a vampire is, then that stat block becomes a little bit outdated. Number 4, we're going to decide whether or not we equip our player characters with the equipment they need to slay our vampire, or not, depending on what we want the feel of the campaign to be. And number 5, and probably the most important step, is exploring the themes of what actually makes vampires frightening and how we can make them frightening by doing all the previous other steps, depending on how we want our players to feel when they come face to face with our vampire. When the word vampire is used in most contexts, most folk, at least in the Western world, are going to imagine an elder European gentleman in fine clothing with sharp fangs and combed back hair. Or they're going to imagine that in some variation where fundamentally a vampire is a person who is slightly pale, who has fangs, and punctures people's neck to drain them of blood. In honesty, that is an image of a vampire that has only really been cemented over the past maybe 50 to 100 years through pop culture and Hollywood, making that depiction of a vampire the most predominant and most popular. But vampires have existed in different mythologies throughout all of human history under a host of different names, where the basic theme is still fundamentally the same. A creature that drains the living for their blood or consumes the living as a way of sustaining themselves. Spanish traditions tell of the bruja, or a word that has become popular through The Witcher is bruxa, which is a Portuguese tradition, where someone has achieved vampirism, they have transformed into an undead creature through witchcraft, rather than being fed the blood of an elder vampire. The Romanian mythologies refer to a creature called the strigoi, which has also been popularized by The Witcher as a striga. Within Witcher mythology, a striga isn't actually classified as a vampire, but the strigoi is where we get a lot of our modern day conceptions of what a vampire is. An individual that has risen from the grave, a restless spirit that can transform into animals, become invisible, and drains others for their vitality. Very famously, Norse mythology features the draugr, restless spirits that consume the living to sustain themselves, and these have very closely linked with vampires as well. Going to get the pronunciation of this next one wrong, I believe it's the Penanggalan, which is from Malay mythology, and is one of my favorite vampire myths because it's basically a woman who is a disembodied head, yet out the bottom of her neck still hangs all of her internal organs as she floats through the night looking for children to consume. In Slavic folklore, there is the upir, which is a creature that has an intense emotional connection to their victims, such as an infatuation. And in Australian First Nations mythology, there is, and again I might mispronounce this, the Yaramayahu, which is a little red, almost goblin or frog-like creature that sits in a fig tree, waiting for a traveler to take rest beneath, and then falls down from the tree, drains the victim of their blood through suction cups on the end of their fingers, and then eats the victim whole. The point that I'm making is that you definitely don't need a vampire to be associated with bats or fangs or any of those sort of things that your players may automatically expect a vampire to be. And in fact, you can use any of these older, different myths. You can use the word bruxa or upir or strigoi instead of vampire. Just the word vampire is totally overused. It isn't scary anymore to consider something to be a vampire, but using older words, these sound more ancient and more threatening and less well understood. And so even just replacing the name of your vampire in your D&D campaign can make them feel more threatening. Step 2. Let's subvert some expectations. Now that we have so many more vampire myths to use for inspiration, we no longer need to sit with that narrow expectation of what vampires are weak against or even what vampires are good at. Whenever your players hear that there is a vampire that is going to be threatening them, they're going to stock up, as I mentioned earlier, on the garlic, the steaks, the silver, the water, could be holy water, or they could just get a bucket because vampires are apparently weak to running water, or they might buy a house and decide to take shelter in it because the vampire can't enter a house without an invitation.
What have you, can I come in the room?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, I walk in the room a little bit.
So what a weird
still
question.
holding a giant sword.
Invited in, he's a vampire.
Don't need to be invited in, but yeah.
I don't? Oh.
They might even just get a bucket of grain and scatter it across their threshold. So when the vampire comes a-knocking, it looks down, sees all the grain on the ground, and is compelled to throw themselves at the ground, count every piece of grain. Inevitably, the sun rises, and they are scorched and burned into ashes because of their weakness to the sun. Well, let's rewrite that narrative. In Bram Stoker's Dracula actually isn't weak to the sun, or at least it doesn't cause him to burn up and turn to ash. In fact, Dracula is quite capable of walking around in the daylight. It's just that he's not as empowered during the day. He can't turn into animals. He's not quite as strong, although he still does have some level of supernatural strength. So you can just scrap that aspect of what a vampire is if you want to. Vampires getting harmed by running water has always felt a little bit silly to me. I like the idea that vampires are scared of the open ocean because they know they cannot drown. What greater hell could you imagine than being dunked into the ocean, sinking to the bottom, but being unable to die, trapped within an endless void of darkness? Another common vampire trope is this idea that they can't enter into a house unless invited.
The problem with being a vampire is you have to be invited in to go in.
Like invite us into the bar, please. Okay.
Invite us in.
The weakness to silver doesn't have to be a vampire thing. In fact, I think it's more tied to werewolf mythology, I would think, than explicitly vampires. So you could keep your vampires resistant to even getting damaged by silver. In Anne Rice's novels, vampires can survive even being crushed into a fine paste. They would regenerate back from it. The only thing that is able to kill them is the sunlight and being thrown into a bonfire. You can pick and choose what sort of myths that you want to use to construct your vampires for your D&D campaign. Maybe they don't even have fangs. Maybe they don't even drink blood. Maybe they're a vampire that preys on people while they sleep and eats their dreams by touching their fingertips to the forehead of their victim. Or maybe they're somebody who consumes their victims whole. They're not just drinking blood, but they're absolute cannibals who tear their victims apart and consume them, flesh, bones, and all. Step 3, let's rework a vampire stat block. The vampire stat block in the 5th edition Monster Manual does leave a lot to be desired, and at the center of my issues with it is the fact that the action economy actually isn't that great. The vampire only gets 2 attacks on their turn, one of which is going to be to grapple, so they're not actually dealing any damage, and then the second is going to be to hopefully hit with their second attack and drain the blood of one of the party members. This means in a straight up fight between 1 vampire and 5 party members, the vampire's probably not going to be dealing a whole lot of damage compared to the amount of damage that is going to be wailed upon it by the rest of the party. Even the vampire's legendary actions don't really do a good job of rebalancing the action economy because it takes 2 legendary actions to do a bite attack, which means that the vampire again can only really grapple and then do 1 bite. The player characters might choose not to try to escape the vampire's grapple, but in my experience, they just can't keep up with the amount of damage that the players are putting out. Additionally, the Children of the Night ability where the vampire can summon rats, bats, or wolves to aid it, I think is pretty poor considering that those creatures might show up 4 rounds later. And in my experience, most D&D combats typically go for 2 to 3 rounds, maybe they go to 4. If the vampire doesn't use that ability in the first turn, foregoing any attacks in their first turn, then the wolves are probably going to be showing up to a pile of ash or some mist desperately trying to escape. And of course, there's the vampire weaknesses. For me personally, I do remove harmed by running water. I just think that's a little bit silly. I also remove forbiddance, but it's only because I love the players to think that that's a thing. And then when they learn that it's not, it's too late for them to try to flee because the vampires just let themselves inside of the house that the player characters have tried to hole up in. Stake to the heart, I do keep. It is pretty central to most European vampire myths that staking it through the heart is going to kill the vampire. Although if you stake most things through the heart, they're probably going to die anyway, so the players aren't going to come up against stake to the heart all too often. They'll probably just reduce it to 0 hit points and then do that extra little bit of damage they need to do to get rid of its misty escape. But I personally do keep the sunlight sensitivity for thematic purposes, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But you definitely don't need to keep that sunlight sensitivity if you want to catch your player characters off guard with it. Now we've talked about what I would remove from a vampire stat block. Let's talk about what I've added in the past to make my vampires more formidable, more dangerous, and more frightening. Often, I will give my vampires a way to drain enemies of blood without needing to grapple them first, such as a ranged blood drain attack where they draw blood out of their victim's eyes, nose, lips, and ears. They're just draining the blood out of their very pores and drawing it towards themselves to drink. Or I've given vampires sangromancy-like abilities where they cut themselves themselves and then create a spear of blood to attack the enemy from far away. Instead of just turning into mist, I've had vampires be able to become the shadows itself, disappearing through walls so that it cannot be cornered by the party. And there are so many more horrible creatures that a vampire could turn into other than a wolf or a rat or bats. You could have vampires turn into a swarm of spiders or some sort of giant tarantula. You could have the vampire turn into some sort of horrific giant bat creature that fights the party, completely losing all semblance of their masquerade of nobility and becoming something actually monstrous during the climactic conflict with the player characters. Of course, there are some fantastic alternative vampire stat blocks in many of the supplements for 5th edition outside of just the monster manual. In the Grim Hollow Monster Grimoire, there's an entire collection of vampire stat blocks that you can use for the Soman bloodline, which is unique to the Grim Hollow campaign setting, but could easily be ported into any D&D campaign setting if you like the themes that the Soman vampires embody. For example, Soman vampires only become weak to sunlight as they get older, meaning that the ancient vampires of the Crimson Court are protected by those they have created, the younger vampires who can walk around in the daylight and guard their resting places. The Soman Vampire Berserker gains advantage on any of its attack rolls if in its previous turn it regained hit points by draining others of blood, meaning that it makes this vampire more aggressive and more dangerous the more blood it consumes. This extra ability and those like it balance out the action economy of the vampire stat block and also lean into the themes that vampires become more dangerous and more monstrous the more blood they have consumed. Step 4, timing. Choosing when and where you're going to confront your player characters with a vampire is as important to making the vampire seem threatening as recontextualizing the creature itself. There's a very famous story of Tracy Hickman inventing the Ravenloft setting after they encountered a vampire in a random dungeon in a D&D campaign they were playing, and they felt let down by the fact that they just ran across a vampire randomly. They felt that a vampire deserved to be the central villain of a D&D campaign and not some random monster wandering around a dungeon. And I can't help but to agree. If you want to make your vampires frightening, don't just make them a random monster that wanders around in the dark that the players might just trip over. Slowly build up the myth of the vampire. Slowly build up the threat that they pose not just to the party, but the realm around them. There's a reason why in a lot of really good survival horror games like PT or Amnesia: The Dark Descent, that the character that you're playing as isn't given a lot of resources to be able to fight against the threats that they're facing. And it's simply that things aren't frightening if you're capable of overcoming them with ease. And that's part of why vampires don't seem very threatening, is there seems to be a million ways to overcome a vampire by leaning into one of its weaknesses. But we've recontextualized some of the vampire's weaknesses, we've gotten rid of some so that the players can't just lean on those well-trodden meta-knowledge myths, and we're also going to choose what we want the players to be equipped with and where they will fight the vampire. Fighting a vampire in the middle of a day in an open garden isn't very scary, especially if one of the player characters is equipped with the Sun Sword. As soon as the Sun Sword is gotten in Curse of Strahd, a lot of the tension goes out of the campaign because that thing is going to melt Strahd's face faster than a microwave melts a stick of butter. What makes vampires threatening in a lot of the movies that they're featured in is the fact that our poor mortal common folk don't have the tools readily available to them to be able to go and fight the vampire themselves. It's going to be a real challenge. It's going to be almost impossible. Vampires, especially ancient ones, have hundreds, if not thousands of years of experience and surviving, multiple attempts probably to destroy them in the past. So what are the chances that the player characters who have lived for a couple of decades are going to be able to overcome this vampire? The point that I'm making is to make a vampire feel threatening in your D&D campaign, you can't have a party that's over-prepared to go and deal with them. Much like any monster in a dark fantasy D&D setting, have the players fight a vampire possibly when they're a little bit low leveled for it. Build the vampire up over the course of the campaign. Maybe if the vampire is going to be the big bad evil person at the center of your campaign, have them show up early and have them kill an NPC or have them do something to really put the fear of the gods into the player characters, so that when the player characters have no choice but to go and confront the vampire finally, they feel like it is a great threat that they must go and face. If you give them something like the Sun Sword, they're not going to feel the threat of the vampire at all. They're just going to feel like they're walking in and killing any other monster. In this video, it might have felt like I was telling you not to feature a vampire in your D&D campaign, but instead feature a creature that is similar to a vampire or vampire adjacent. And that's not necessarily true. It was more about giving you alternative ideas about the sorts of abilities that your vampires might have and the sorts of weaknesses that they might be immune to. But the truth of what a vampire is, to me at least, is that it's not about the fangs or the blood or the European accoutrement. What makes a vampire is the fact that to sustain themselves, they must destroy the lives of others. And this is not a simple prey-predator relationship. A vampire is not a wolf who kills a sheep because it has to survive and consume the meat. A vampire drains their victims. A vampire has a necrotic effect. It is a slow death, and it is a death that rejuvenates the vampire. It's not just about the satisfaction of a full stomach. It's about feeling reborn, about regaining your power. And what sort of guilt is associated with the fact that for you to feel good about yourself, you have to destroy the life of somebody else? Vampires to me represent the fear within rather than the fear without. What we, humankind, are like at our worst. They represent all of our vices. The vice of consumption and addiction. The vice of destroying others to sustain ourselves. The desire to escape mortality and to live forever. But have you ever thought about what that reality would actually be like? A vampire encapsulates loss and grief because they have to watch as all those they care about around them slowly age and die. And the only way that they can save them is to give those they care about their own dark gift as well. But to do so, they know that they're subjecting that person to a life of consuming blood and destroying the lives of others and this endless guilt that is felt inside. And would you want to inflict that on somebody that you care about? I wrote a D&D campaign not too long ago, which I ended up publishing, called Vault of the Living Flame. And early in the campaign featured a monster called a Valravan. It was a separate monster to a vampire, but it was basically an individual who had turned into a monster because they turned to cannibalism to survive and ate their fellow party members. What was interesting about this monster, though, was the guilt they experienced when they had to kill their fellows to survive themselves. And so as they're attacking the player characters, as they're trying to eat the player characters, they're screaming, "I'm sorry, I don't want to do this. Please run. I can't help myself." And having a vampire scream that at the player characters as it's attacking them, well, that creates a very different reality. The players aren't just fighting a heartless monster, they're fighting the victim itself. I think one of the best ways to represent a vampire in a D&D campaign that makes them feel formidable and frightening is not to feature them as an enemy, but one of the player characters themselves. Subject one of the player characters to going through the transformation of becoming a vampire. The inescapable hunger, the inescapable need to destroy, the inescapable reality that they can't walk out in the daylight anymore. In the Grim Hollow campaign guide, there are actually rules for transformations where player characters can become supernatural beings such as vampires or werewolves or liches. You could use these rules to have one of the player characters have to grapple with the fact that they desire nothing more than to murder the rest of the party. And how do they cope with that? How do they cope with going into a civilized place knowing that they might try to kill any and all of the civilians living there? Perhaps the vampires in your campaign setting, and this is an idea that's just coming to me now. They actually can go out in the sunlight. There's no reason they can't. They're not scorched or burned by the sun, but they choose not to. Almost obsessively, they keep themselves in darkness because of the intense guilt that they feel over the creature that they are slowly turning into. They don't go out in the daylight because they can't stand the feeling that everybody can see them. Of course, there are always those vampires that don't feel any guilt over killing. Those vampires that enjoy their bloodlust. They hold masquerade balls where victims hang from the ceilings and are tapped like kegs. Well, these vampires can be used in your D&D campaign to juxtapose the guilt of transforming into a vampire because they represent the ultimate reprehensible monster that all vampires inevitably become. And that's how I represent vampires in my D&D campaign. That's what they mean to me, and that's why I think they're one of the most horrifying and best monsters to feature in all of human mythology. Do you agree? Will you feature a horrific vampire in your D&D campaign? Leave me a comment down below. Tell me stories of when you've successfully had vampires scare your player characters. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, and we will be back next week, as every week, with more ideas about how to run Dungeons & Dragons Dark Fantasy.